Dave Bolger here, and welcome to Had I Known, conversations with interesting members of the Hamilton College community. This week's guest is John Hewko, class of 1979. All right, want to start by welcoming in all the new listeners who discovered Had I Known thanks to the Hamilton Alumni Magazine. Clearly, they wanted to balance out the beautiful people on the cover with the face for radio inside. I'm appreciative of the coverage, and especially appreciative of the slimming angle and lens that they shot that photo with. So, top-notch photographers at Hamilton shooting that magazine. So, thank you for that. But definitely seen an increase in listeners since that article came out. So welcome to all you new listeners. And if you like what you're hearing, come check us out on social media, Had I Known Show. Because if you're not checking out the show on social media, you may miss out on giveaways. Just did our first ever giveaway. We asked for people to share what they wish they had known when they were students at Hamilton. And Gabby Scully, class of 93, had a great answer. And because of that answer, she'll now be sporting a Missy Siegel Buffalo Buttes jersey. So congratulations, Gabby. Thanks to you and to everyone who took part. Who knows? Maybe we'll have some other giveaways coming up. So we have an interesting one this week, and timely. John Hewko, the CEO of Rotary International, has deep ties with Ukraine. But as I prepared for this conversation with John, I certainly was reading about and watching the news coverage of Ukraine, couldn't help but see all the talk of the refugee situation that's now been created because of the war in Ukraine. And that reminded me that it wasn't so long ago that I had a conversation on this show with Matt Zeller about the refugee situation in Afghanistan. And of course, the interest in that story was incredibly high at the time. In fact, it skyrocketed to be one of the most listened to episodes of this show ever. I found myself reflecting on the words of Professor Mark Cryer. Professor Cryer asks his students, how long is your anger? How long will you remain angry and motivated by what was going on in the country? So with Professor Cryer's words in my mind, I gave Matt a call to see how things are going, because that's not anywhere in the major news coverage right now. And not surprisingly, Matt is still working tirelessly to help get those that helped U.S. troops out of Afghanistan. And as he told me, it's good and bad news. He said the good news is one of the things that he and the group he helps co-chair, the Association of Wartime Allies, one of the things they've been pushing for is the creation of the Afghan War Commission. As Matt put it, this commission should help our country and the world really learn from the Afghan war and to avoid any mistakes that transpired. He relayed a story to me about a friend of his who is a college professor who teaches a class on 9/11. And every student in that class, of course, was not alive when 9/11 happened. And this professor says that the 9/11 Commission report is, in fact, the best text to use to teach the class. And Matt is hopeful that the report that comes out of the Afghan War Commission can serve a similar purpose to future generations. Now, he says he's also encouraged that this commission is truly bipartisan. So this isn't about politics. This is about truly learning what happened. Learn from the mistakes so we don't repeat them. But on the flip side, he said there's still some sobering news and immense challenges faced in Afghanistan. First, he says that he and his colleagues have been working with the U.S. government behind the scenes to try and negotiate the evacuation of as many of these Afghans as possible who helped the Americans. But once the war in Ukraine started, all eyes shifted there. Matt says the Taliban cracked down, walked away from the table. And apparently now the Taliban has said no one can leave the country. And when you take that news and match it to the report the Association of Wartime Allies recently released about what's going on the ground in Afghanistan, it's frightening. The report finds that 78,000 special immigrant visa applicants have been left behind in Afghanistan. The report finds that these 78,000 people face tremendous risks, including violence and substantial economic hardship. They've lost their jobs, they go without food, many of them have been killed. Now, if this report had come out 6-7 months ago when I talked to Matt, it would have gotten tremendous attention. But as Matt points out, when the Association of Wartime Allies released this report, barely a blip in the media. How long is your anger? I will have a link to this report in the show notes, but you can go to wartimeallies.co, wartimeallies.co, if you want to check it out. But again, I'll have it in the show notes as well. Encourage you to read it. In my phone call with Matt this week, he said he ends many of his speaking engagements by telling the crowd history is made by those who show up. As we pivot to this week's guest, John Hewko, he has several examples of showing up and being a part of history. And literally helping to write history, as he was part of the group that helped craft the Ukrainian Constitution. He has an incredible story, has deep ties to Ukraine, and shares some interesting thoughts on the situation there now. John is the General Secretary and Chief Executive Officer of Rotary International and the Rotary Foundation. And speaking of showing up, his organization has raised a significant amount of money for the humanitarian effort in Ukraine. He holds a law degree from Harvard, a master's in modern history from Oxford University, where he studied as a Marshall Scholar, and while at Hamilton studied government and Soviet studies. You'll hear him talk about how while he was an international partner at the law firm Baker and McKenzie, he helped establish the firm's Moscow office, and then was the managing partner of its office in Kyiv and Prague. During all that time, as I said, had a front row seat to history, as he was part of the working group that helped prepare the initial draft of the Ukrainian post-Soviet constitution. He's a fascinating guy. I really enjoyed talking to him. I hope you enjoy this conversation. Here is John Hewko, class of 1979.
Okay.
And as you can see, this I know you do a lot of NPR work. We're not in the NPR studio here.
Yeah, so it's, but all the NPRs, that's all they do it.
A lot of them are actually doing it like this too, I think.
Exactly, or you just call on your cell phone and
exactly. And but this will air on WHCL in Clinton, New York. So.
Oh, well, there we go.
So this is as I mentioned in my email. I started doing this to talk to interesting members of the Hamilton community about sort of, their connection to the school and what they've done since. And again, in normal circumstances, I think it would be interesting to talk to you, but given what's going on in the world right now, it's even more interesting and appropriate. And certainly want to get into all that in your history and connection to Ukraine. But I guess since it is a Hamilton podcast, we'll start with Hamilton, and I'll ask, how did you end up there?
Well, I was born in Detroit and grew up in Detroit, and then my parents moved to Ohio when I was 10 years old, and I went to a boarding school outside of Cleveland, and wanted to go out east. And at that time, the small liberal arts colleges were kind of in vogue, and so I applied to Princeton, Williams, Hamilton, and Union. Got into all four, and decided to go to Hamilton. I just liked the school, and the campus was very similar to the boarding school I went to. Chapels look almost identical. It's just Western Reserve Academy had red brick, and Hamilton had brown brick. And so I think my decision in terms of where I went to college was in some ways based on the similarity of the two campuses. It was a great decision. I enjoyed Hamilton. Had a great 4 years there.
What talk to me a little bit about your experience there in the mid to late 70s. What was campus like back then?
Well, it was still, it was Hamilton and Kirkland, and so
Yep.
it was a very different experience than I suspect the students have today. I say I probably spent 95% of my time on the Hamilton side. I did have a scholarship job my freshman year where I had to wash pots over at McEwen, so I did make it over there for that. And then I think senior year I had a photography class at on the Kirkland side of the campus. But it was. I suspect now, obviously, it's one school, but back then there was, there were two different schools, so it was a slightly different dynamic than what you have today.
And your connection to Ukraine, I know there's a family connection, but as I understand it, you did some studies around the topic. Is that right?
Yeah, my parents were from Ukraine. They came to the States in 1949 after the Second World War, and so I grew up in the Ukrainian American community in Detroit, and went to the Saturday language schools, et cetera, et cetera. And when I came to Hamilton, I was very fortunate because at that time, Hamilton had brought on board a professor, Orest Subtelny, who was probably one of the preeminent Ukrainian American historians in the States at the time. And I was very fortunate to have him at Hamilton during the 4 years I was there. So he taught, Russian history, he taught Middle Eastern history, but I was able to do a number of independent projects with him that focused specifically on Ukraine. And so I was a government, and I guess they called it at the time, Russian studies major at Hamilton. And then when I was fortunate enough to win a Marshall Scholarship to go to study at Oxford for 2 years, I did a master's in modern history at Oxford, again focusing on Ukraine, and particularly Ukraine during the Bolshevik Revolution, 1917 to 1921. So again, having Professor Subtelny at Hamilton was a really stroke of luck, because shortly thereafter he left Hamilton and moved up to Toronto to assume a chair there in Toronto.
Timing is everything in life, right?
Exactly.
And then, what was the plan coming out of school? What did you want to be when you grew up?
Well, I loved Perry Mason as a kid, and so I loved watching Perry Mason. So I said I wanted to be a lawyer. So I finished at Hamilton, and I had applied to a number of law schools and gotten into a few, and then the Marshall Scholarship came along, and so I took that. And then after I finished at Oxford, I took an extra year, and with a group of friends, we bought two sort of these Bedford RL troop sort of transport thing. On the TV shows, they have these two benches, parallel benches, and they kind of look like a covered wagon type trucks. We bought two of them. We stripped one down for spare parts, and we fixed the other one up. And then we drove from London down to Cape Town. This was in 1981, and it took about 7 months for that trip. And then we got to Zimbabwe, to Harare. We sold the truck, and it was 8 of us. Everyone kind of went their separate ways, and I had wanted to get to Latin America and learn Spanish. I spoke Ukrainian at the time. I spoke Russian. Certainly, Ukrainian wasn't a terribly useful language at that point, and it was the Soviet Union. There was not much you could do. And I was sort of saw that, given the demographic changes in the United States, Spanish was going to become an increasingly more important language. And so I wanted to get to Latin America somehow. And so I hitchhiked from Harare down to Cape Town, and I had a friend of mine who's from Oxford. We rode together. His father was a banker in Cape Town, and there was a yacht race that would every 3 years used to go from Cape Town to Rio, and then the Brazilians, because of apartheid, wouldn't allow the race to go there. So it was from Cape Town to Punta del Este in Uruguay, which is a resort town on the Uruguayan coast. And so I said, okay, well, let's see if I can get on as a crew member and get over to Latin America somehow. And so Nick's father had some in and was able to get me into the yacht club in Cape Town. And I just went with my little backpack from yacht to yacht. And I had a great opening line where I said, hey guys, I just drove in from London. I literally had, do you guys have need a crew member? And it's a pretty serious race. And they had 3 categories of boats based on size. And so I, no, we've already got our crew, and so I just showed up at the day of the race, like 2 hours before it started, and I'm just hanging out. And one of the skippers comes up to me and goes, "Hey, didn't I talk to you yesterday?" And I said, "Yeah." He goes, "Well, one of my guys got drunk last night, fell off the boat and hurt his back. We need a crew member like right now because we're leaving in an hour." And I said, he goes, "You've sailed before?" And I said, "Yeah, sure." And I hadn't. And so I just called a friend. One of the guys on the trip was in Johannesburg. I called him and asked him if he could call my parents and let them know that I'll call them in a month when I get to Uruguay, and that I was getting on this South African 12-meter yacht that with a bunch of guys I'd never met before. So I jumped on, and they quickly discovered I didn't really know much about sailing, but it was too late by then. But it was a great group of guys, and we actually, our boat won on actual and handicap time. So it was again, right place at the right time.
Timing is everything in life. Yeah.
And then got to Argentina, and then we got to Uruguay, and then went to Argentina, and there's a big Ukrainian community there, and so I kind of plugged in with them and found a place to stay, etc., and really put my nose to the grindstone to learn Spanish. And then several months after I got there, the conflict with the UK over the Malvinas or Falklands came up, so I was kind of there for that whole process. So it was a great. Not only a great 2 years at Oxford, but a great period after that before I came back to the States to go to law school, which made law school very, very mundane and boring.
I was just going to say, it's hard to top that as a life experience. My goodness.
After everything I'd done there. So,
make a movie of your experience. My goodness.
Figuring out whether, torts and contracts was somewhat different experience.
And then how did you end up in Ukraine? Because much has been made about your role in helping to craft the Ukrainian Constitution, and you were there for their independence. How did that come about?
Well, when I finished law school at Harvard, I wanted to, there's not much to do with law in the Soviet Union at the time. I graduated from law school in 1985, and it was still the Soviet Union. And so I was very focused on Latin America. And so I went and worked for 2 years for a year in Argentina, a year in Brazil for local law firms. And then I came back to DC and started working for a Los Angeles firm, their DC office, mostly on Latin American transactions. And then Gorbachev, perestroika, the country started, Soviet Union started opening up. And I had a good friend over at Baker & McKenzie, which is at that time the largest firm in the world, a classmate from law school whose father was a partner in their DC office. And I kind of reached out to him and I said, is you guys thinking of doing anything in Moscow and moving into the Soviet Union? And they came back and said, yeah, we're thinking of opening an office. We need some folks to go out and help us do that. And so I left the firm I was with, joined Baker & McKenzie. And my wife is from Argentina, and we got married in Argentina. And then, literally 2 weeks later, moved to Moscow. So I like to say we moved to Moscow in January of 1990, January 3rd, I think. And I like to say she's probably the first and last Argentine in history to take her honeymoon in the Ukraine hotel in Moscow in the middle of January. But, and then, we lived in Moscow for a year and a half, Soviet hotel room. And then I was practicing law, helping open the Baker McKenzie office. I was an associate at the time. And then I got the opportunity to go to Ukraine for a year to work as a legal advisor to the Ukrainian parliament, funded by George Soros. And so I took a leave of absence from the firm. We got on a train, took our stuff, moved to Ukraine, to Kyiv, and lived there in a hotel room for 2 years, and worked that year in the parliament. And of course, Ukraine became independent during that period. So I was very active in that whole independence movement. Was in the parliament building the day that Ukraine declared independence. Wow. And then worked on some of those early laws, put together that constitution. We put together a group of Ukrainian constitutional experts, and we put together the first initial draft of the constitution. It was adopted many years later in a vastly, somewhat different form, but that was kind of the first original official draft of a potential Ukrainian post-Soviet constitution. So that was a fantastic run.
Wow.
And then after my year ended in working for the parliament, I then opened the Baker & McKenzie office in Ukraine and stayed another 4 years before moving on to Prague. But I do, Dave, have one one sort of Andy Warhol 5 minutes in the sun story with regard to independence. As you recall, the coup in Moscow happened on August 19th, 1991. And the night before, I had my wife and I and a Ukrainian lawyer who wound up being the first lawyer I hired when I opened the Baker and McKenzie office. We were in a town called Zaporizhia, which you can see a lot on the news now. It's where that nuclear power plant is that the Russian army was attacking the other day. And we were at a rock concert, one of these unheard of new things is happening, and I was walking along the river there with Alexei was his name. And I said, Alexei, it's amazing. Here I am, son of Ukrainian bourgeois nationalist emigres, enemies of the people. And I've got my ID card with a hammer and sickle on it, working in the Ukrainian parliament. You and I are walking along here, speaking completely openly. Very few restrictions. It has to be some sort of counter-revolution. I just can't imagine that the communist old guard is going to let this continue. And he's like, yeah, I see what you're saying. So we flew to Kyiv that night. And the next morning, I get a call at 7:00 from him. And he says, Ivan, John, you remember we talked about last night? And I said, yeah, I do. And he said, turn on the TV. And I click it on TV, and it was the coup, the junta, they're playing Swan Lake is airing, and all these directives coming from the junta. And so then right after that, so I immediately went, and my wife, who's from Argentina and who, has been through a lot of coups in her life, was like, we're out of here. And I said, no, this is a historic moment. And so I went over to the Parliament building and spent the 3 days of the coup inside the building, and a lot of interesting insights in terms of the dynamic between what was happening in Ukraine and Moscow, et cetera, et cetera. But the Andy Warhol moment came that when Yeltsin got on the tank in front of the White House in Moscow, I think it was on the 21st, 2 days later, it was clear that the coup had failed. Mm-hmm. And so the Ukrainians parliament called a special session for the 24th, a few days later, to determine how they were going to react to the events that occurred in Moscow. And in the parliament, Ukrainian parliament at the time was 25% sort of democratic leaning and 75% communist. So the communists had the overwhelming majority in the parliament at the time. And so the night before the 24th, the Democratic faction, that 25%, met on the third floor of the parliament building to kind of determine what their strategy was going to be for the next day, for the 24th. And a big debate broke out between them, where there was one faction that was saying, let's go for independence. Let's declare independence tomorrow. This is our golden opportunity to do that. And there was another group that said, no, we don't want to be independent in a communist-led regime. So let's first deal with the decommunization of Ukraine and worry about independence later. Mm-hmm. And I'm sitting here listening to this debate and going, gee, this must have been what it was like in, Philadelphia on July 3rd or whatever.
Right.
1776. And at the end of the day, the decision to go to independent, to try to declare independence the next day, won over. And so they started preparing all these decrees, depoliticizing the KGB, nationalizing communist party property, like a series of 10 or 12, maybe there's even more than that, decrees that they wanted to have approved the next day. And they're working out all this stuff. And one of these deputies comes up to me and he says, John, we've got a problem. I said, what's the deal? He said, we have no way of photocopying all these things so that they can be distributed to be voted on tomorrow when the parliament meets. And I said, well, why don't you just go to the secretariat? They were very hard to get photocopy machines at the time in Ukraine. And they have a copier there. And they said, no, the secretariat's run by the communists. They'll never let us copy this stuff. And so I said, okay. And I had a small little Canon PC7 computer copy machine. My wife had just brought some paper for me from Moscow. She'd been up there shopping. Thus, we had to go to Moscow to buy our stuff largely. Wow. And so I took all these decrees, and we had to do 4 to a page because we didn't have enough paper to do 1 per page. And with a student at the university, we spent in one of the rooms across the street from the parliament, we spent all night making 450 copies of each of these decrees. The next morning at 7 a.m, I show up in the parliament building, hand it to the deputy head of the opposition. Communists are like, where all this stuff come from? And then 6 hours later, Ukraine declared independence. Now, I'm sure what happened regardless. But sometimes I wonder what would have happened had
If you didn't have the copy machine, what would happen, right?
Yeah, coffee machine and the paper. So again,
Wow.
my Andy Warhol 15 minutes or whatever in the sun, and
A literal front seat to the history of that country. That's incredible.
There you go.
Incredible. Well, listen, I hear you talk about buying a truck and driving from London down to Cape Town. I hear you talk about talking your way onto a yacht with no experience, refusing to leave in the middle of a coup, working your way into having this. Do you have the ability to experience fear, or there's just no fear in your body?
Well, as I get older, the fear level obviously starts increasing. Back then, when you're young, you're kind of indestructible. And we were like, I was in my early 30s. We were masters of the universe. We thought we could. There's nothing we couldn't do. And in that part, and for people working and practicing law, or just in that part of the world at that time, we were young. We didn't have that many obligations. We didn't have the mortgages, the kids, and all that. You kind of have a level of fear that as you get older, you sort of lose a little bit.
Yeah. And then that experience in Ukraine and literally having a front seat to their history and their independence. And as I understand it, still friends and family there now. What I imagine you're not surprised to see the resolve that the country's showing right now. What else do Americans watching what's unfolding there? What else should we know about the Ukrainian people?
Yeah, well, it's been an evolutionary process in the development of Ukrainian statehood. If you look how Ukraine was in 1991 when it declared independence, they had a referendum in December. And that referendum was overwhelmingly approved by all of the states, or oblasts, they call it in Ukraine, the provinces, including Crimea. Crimea voted a little over 50%, but a majority did vote for independence. So there was overwhelming support for independence. But the country at that time was still, in many ways, several countries within a country. You had Western Ukraine, which was Catholic, Ukrainian speaking, only became part of the Soviet Union after the Second World War. You had Eastern Ukraine, which was Russian speaking, and Central Ukraine, Orthodox, much more sort of pro-Russian leaning. Villages, Ukrainian speaking, cities, Russian speaking. Crimea, obviously, a whole different kettle of fish. So there wasn't, I would say, a completely formed sense of Ukrainian nationhood. And if you've got a Ukrainian speaker in far eastern Ukraine, they kind of look at you weird. Or if you're a Russian speaker from Luhansk in western Ukraine, they kind of like, And so that's where it kind of started. And it was an evolutionary process as it had to develop its statehood. It had to develop its. One of the interesting things, Dave, is that when the Soviet Union fell apart, everything, it was a highly centralized country. Everything ran through Moscow. The deal that was cut back then was that Russia, the Russian Federation, which emerged out of the fall of the Soviet Union, would assume all the Soviet debts and obligations, but also got all the Soviet assets, embassies, ministries, etc. So Russia was able to kind of just, pick up where the Soviet Union ended. Mm-hmm. A place like Ukraine had to really not only make that transition from communism to a post-communist society, but it had to build all of the different organs and institutions of statehood, various ministries, armed forces, etc. And so I remember the Ministry of Foreign Economic Relations, which is an important ministry, four guys sitting around a room, not much bigger than a hotel room, and the Ministry of Finance. It was really the Kyiv, the Ukrainian branch of Bank, which so they had that double two-track not only that difficult transition, but they had to build sort of state institutions from scratch. So it was a long process to get to where they are today. But what's interesting is that Putin, whose goal is, as we see now, obviously to take over Ukraine, create a puppet state, recreate the Soviet Union, recreate the Russian Empire, he, more than anyone, his actions over the last 20 years have done probably more than anything to create a completely united Ukraine. Regardless of whether it's Russian-speaking, Ukrainian-speaking, Orthodox, Catholic, Protestant, Ukraine today is a full-fledged nation in every sense of the word. And this war was just that final stamp on that. So it's completely backfired on Putin.
How so? And in what ways has he played that role?
Well, because, all this, over the last 20 years, all this talk of Ukraine is not a nation, Ukrainian aren't a people. It's not a language. We are all just Russians. It's one country. Obviously, his invasion
that has rallied the Ukrainian.
Yeah, absolutely. His invasion of Crimea, all this rhetoric that he's had in the run up to this war, and now this war where he's literally scorch earthing and torching the country.
Yeah.
I was literally before I got on with you, I was I had a long chat with actually with the gentleman I talked to you about that we were walking along the river in 1991, and he was like, John, this country is as united as we've ever seen it. I mean, you've got if you look at it, Kharkiv, Sumy, Chernihiv, Mariupol, all these cities that are fighting to the death now that you hear about in the news, they're all Russian-speaking cities, and yet they're and the anger and the hatred, for lack of a better word, that's now the people have toward the Russians is and Putin and is quite extraordinary. So through all that he did, he's in effect has completely backfired on him, and he's in effect created this Ukrainian nation.
He seems to have no way out of this now, right? I mean, he's gotten way more than he clearly bargained for. How does this end?
Well, I mean, that's the $64,000 question, right, Dave? I think he's to the point now where he's got no choice but to just press forward, and I think a defeat here would be, I would suspect, the end of his regime. Yeah. I think ultimately what's going to have to end this is the Russian people and the Russian elites standing up and showing the same level of courage that the Ukrainians showed in 2014 with the Orange Revolution, in 2014 with Maidan and Crimean invasion, and now with this extraordinarily heroic effort that they're showing against the overwhelming Russian military force. The Russian people and their elites need to do the same. Ultimately, that's what's going to end all this, in my view.
And as the sanctions continue to take effect and cripple that economy, at some point they have to feel that and react, no?
Well, sure. And you're already seeing, a lot of Russians are leaving. Apparently the trains to Finland are packed. Can't use the Apple Pay and, all this. So I think they're going to start feeling it. But, Putin has countermeasures. He's got the gas and the oil. And one thing that surprised me was how dependent Europe became on Russian oil and gas, particularly after Crimea. What's ironic is that Germany, for example, is more dependent today on Russia than it was prior to the Crimean invasion. So, he does have obviously significant leverage in that area over the West.
Do you think the U.S. is doing enough?
I'd like to see I think, first of all, I think we didn't do enough earlier. I think after Crimea, there was a concern about provoking Putin, and we don't want to go into and I get that thinking, right? It's like, okay, let's, but in the end, that was a bad bet, because we did help Ukraine, and obviously they've been able to withstand this onslaught so far because of a lot of the help that the West provided through the years. But I think we should have done much, much more, because at the end of the day, it was a bad bet. We didn't, quote unquote, do things so as not to provoke him, but in the end, the war happened. And in my view, this was in some ways going to happen, was inevitable, because NATO expansion is, one could argue, is perhaps a factor in his sort of desire to get Ukraine back and to do what he's doing now. But I think it goes much more beyond that, because NATO is a defensive alliance. Ukraine posed zero military threat to Russia, zero. It was more about recreating the Russian Empire, recreating the Soviet Union, and also recapturing, in some ways, 500 years of history. Because, anybody who, certainly in my day, took a course on Russian history, it starts with Kievan Rus in the 10th century and ends, in modern times, and you see the word Ukraine mentioned 3 or 4 times. So it's very difficult for the Russians to claim that 400 or 500 years of Kievan Rus history is their exclusive history when it's the capital of a country called Ukraine. So there's a huge historical, profoundly psychological aspect, I think, to his desire to recapture Ukraine. So my sense is this was inevitable, and we put a bad bet on, worrying about provoking him, because we tried not to, and in the end, he wound up attacking anyhow.
Up to including him standing at the border with troops and still not doing enough at that point, right? I mean,
right, exactly.
Yeah.
And if you just read his July 2021 essay, that sort of historical essay he wrote, where he says Ukraine, again, isn't a people, the Ukrainian state is a fiction of Lenin and Stalin, it was da-da-da-da-da, you realize that this is way beyond, NATO expansion. This is something that's, profoundly almost probably psychological and sort of messianic
Yeah.
in his mind.
And the friends and family you have there, are they safe? Are they okay? How are they doing?
Well, most of my family is in Western Ukraine, in a city called Ternopil. And some of them have gone to my father's village, which is safer in the village, which is about 5 kilometers away from the city. Some have sent their family abroad, or have safely gotten to Poland. Others have stayed. I have another son of a cousin who runs a adventure kind of backpacking, outward bound type of company, and they're using their cottages and their tents and all that to house refugees. But it's tough. When I call them and they're like, John, we gotta stop talking at 10 o'clock. We have to turn off all the lights. We're expecting a potential air raids, sirens going off. And I've got a lot of friends and former colleagues who are still in Kyiv, the capital. And one who has medical issues. He and his wife can't leave. They have a 17-year-old son. The other day, they went to the train station, got him on a train, gave him some money in stuff, and he made it across the border into Poland. And then from there, we were able to get him to a family in Krakow. So these scenes are being repeated hundreds and hundreds of thousands of times a day. And not just the refugees, the slaughter that's happening of innocent civilians, bombing hospitals, bombing maternity wards, indiscriminately bombing apartment buildings. It's horrific what's happening.
I know your organization, Rotary International, raised a significant amount of money to help the cause. For those listening and people who want to do something, what's the best way that the average person can help make an impact?
Well, right now, what the most we can do to help is twofold. One is through encouraging our Western leadership to continue to support Ukraine, to continue ratcheting up the sanctions, and to continue the flow of weaponry to Ukraine. On the humanitarian side, obviously, we're seeing folding in front of us, over 2 million refugees now in 2 weeks. It's going to continue to grow over time. It's going to continue to grow, and that's what's the immediate need where I think we can help is with that humanitarian assistance. There's a lot of great organizations that you can contribute to. Rotary, we've established a disaster response fund for Ukraine. We've raised, I think in 4 days, we raised over $1 million, and we continue to raise money. And that money will be used to will be given to Rotary clubs and Rotarians in the frontline countries, plus in Ukraine, for dealing with refugee issues, medicine, shelter, food, etc. And again, we've seen a huge outpouring of support of Rotarians. Again, in a very short period, raised over $1 million, and I suspect we'll raise considerably more than that.
I know you were instrumental in establishing a Rotary Club in Ukraine. Was that your first foray with Rotary?
It was, and but to our listeners, so they can maybe put it in context. I mean, Rotary was founded in 1905 in Chicago by a guy named Paul Harris, and it was the original LinkedIn before anybody had heard of LinkedIn. and Paul set up a Rotary to bring business leaders together and help each other with their businesses, provide leads and business contacts to each other. That was the original purpose. And then it expanded to community service. And so Rotary today is an organization, we have 1.4 million Rotarians around the world, 37,000 Rotary clubs. 75% of our Rotarians are now outside the United States. And it's really the mixture of commerce and cause. So you would join a Rotary club to, network professionally, meet some great people in your community, but also to make a difference, either locally, regionally, or globally. And so Rotary clubs do an awful lot of community service, I said, on all those levels. And our sort of signature global initiative is the eradication of polio. Back in 1985, Rotary took on the task of, all right, smallpox had been eradicated. Let's see if we can get polio eradicated. And we were joined by WHO, CDC, and UNICEF. And, we started with 350,000 cases of polio a year back then, and we're down to just 2 countries, Afghanistan and Pakistan, where the wild virus is still circulating. So, and Rotarians, I think, have contributed well over $2 billion over the years to the polio eradication effort. So it's it's kind of this intersection between commerce and cause, this huge global network to do good do good in the world. So my father was a longstanding Rotarian in a town north of Detroit, Clarkston. And so when I was working in the parliament in Ukraine, his club and 5 other clubs around the world wanted to sponsor the first Rotary Club in Kyiv after the fall of the Soviet Union. And so since I was there on the ground, he said, can you give me a hand? Can you give us a hand? I did. We set up that first club. I was a charter member. And so that was sort of my first foray into Rotary was in Ukraine in 1992.
Wow. And now you're in charge of it all.
Well, yes. Like Toynbee says, history is cyclical. What might be interesting for the Hamilton students who are listening is that we also have something we call Rotaract clubs. And these are clubs for people between 18 and 32. And we have a lot of these Rotaract clubs that are created at universities around the country and around the world. And we also have community-based Rotaract clubs. And they're really clubs focused on really doing good and doing community service. So I would urge that if there's any of your listeners are interested in setting up a Rotaract club at Hamilton, reach out to me or to reach out to Rotary leadership in the Utica area. And they can sort of guide you on how to set up a club. And we have probably about 300,000 Rotaractors around the world. It's a great network. They do a lot of stuff together and really try to make a difference in their communities.
That's interesting. I was going to ask you about membership and bringing in new members, if that's a way to attract younger membership. And presumably those people then go out and then start to join other clubs as they establish their careers.
Exactly. And so and we're working very hard to help even facilitate that transition from being a Rotaractor to being a Rotarian. But and then we also have something called Interact, which is clubs that are for 12 to 18-year-olds, really high school based clubs. And actually we have probably about 400,000 interactors, even more around the world. And again, focus on giving back, community service, et cetera. There'll usually be a Rotary club or a Rotaract club that sponsors an Interact club at a school.
Speaking of advice to Hamilton students, I'm curious to hear what your advice might be to a soon-to-be graduate looking to go out into the world. They're entering the world during a time of incredible unsteadiness, and you, as someone who seemed to was willing to throw somewhat caution to the wind or try different things and not necessarily follow the typical path of a student, what advice do you have to those entering the world now?
Well, I think I always took the view that you have to do in each phase of life what you could actually do in that phase of life that you may not be able to do in a different phase. And so when I there's nothing wrong with that, but they're going to college, grad school, job, that's nothing wrong with that. That's not a path I wanted to follow. I figured, when I'm 80 and someone else is 80 and I've worked 50 years and someone else has worked 53 years or 54 years, it's not going to matter. And so those years between college and when you really want to settle down, I think are crucial years to do things that are unique, that you have passion for, and that you can only do at that time. And that's what I did. Yes, I was fortunate to have won the Marshall Scholarship. That did open for me a great opportunity. I wanted to learn languages. I wanted to learn the world. I wanted to see the world and experience the world. That's what I wanted to do. And the Marshall Scholarship gave me that opportunity. And subsequent to that, everything was really focused on sort of international types of things. But don't, and it's changing now. I see my daughter's generation. She's a 2015 graduate from Hamilton. This sort of adventure, going out, traveling the world is much more common than it was certainly back in 1979 when I graduated. And grab those opportunities. You can always work. You can always make money later. Can't wait too long, right? Because at some point you do have to settle down, make money, and get going. Right. But those kinds of experiences are unique to that time in life, and don't be scared. Go for it, and the benefit will definitely definitely be there.
For sure. And as you think back to your days, your first arrival, switching from red bricks to brown bricks, and thinking across what you've experienced, all the incredible experience you had, you think back to those days. Is there anything you wish you had known?
Yeah, I think I'm very happy with the way I which I worked really hard. I was a good student at Hamilton. I worked hard. I played lacrosse. I was tri-captain of the team, and it's. I wish the field house had been built earlier. It was built it opened up, I think, our senior year, and so before that we had to practice indoors in the gym with these tape balls, the old gym, and sometimes we couldn't get on the field until the first game. So the facilities, and just in general, the facilities at Hamilton now are just so much better than when we were there. It's
right.
So I was very envious of my daughter who.
Yeah, I went back recently, and it's it just continues to get better. And I told some current students, I said, your Hamilton is a heck of a lot better than my Hamilton was.
Yeah. What year were you, Dave?
99.
Okay, right. So you were kind of sort of
so my Hamilton, my facilities were better than yours, and theirs were better than mine.
Exactly. Well, that's the sort of a progression and the progression in life.
As it should be. Well, John, I really appreciate you taking the time. I want to be respectful of your time. I really appreciate this. I learned a heck of a lot. I know people will as well.
Oh, thanks for having me, Dave. And it's all the best to the Hamilton students. You're entering obviously a world that's a lot of conflict, a lot of tension, a lot of issues. But I think you're well poised and well trained to make a difference. And again, it sounds cliche-ish, but really, if you've something you're really passionate, really interested about, that you can only do at this stage in life, do it. You could always go to work. You can always make money later. These are those 3 years, 4 years after you're out of college are really ideal times to really do something different, adventuresome, something you can remember for the rest of your life, something where you can try to really make an impact, and then then you can get back to sort of life as we expect it and know it. So
boring grown-ups. Yeah.
Yeah. There you go.
All right, that's John Hewko, class of 1979. What a fascinating guy. He's clearly lived a life. Impressive story. I wish him and his friends and family in Ukraine well, and hope they all make it through this thing safe. You have been listening to Had I Known on WHCL FM, Clinton, New York. HadIKnown.buzzsprout.com. Had I Known Show on social media. As always, my thanks to Dr. Michael Woods for supplying the music on the show. And, once again, Doc is going to play us out. Hope you enjoyed the show. We'll talk to you next week.
Had I Known podcast show on your radio or take it to go.